This is TWiT.
You may not have been very familiar with Zoom prior to the pandemic. Chances are you've heard about it since then, though. It seems like everybody's talking about Zoom. Very likely you've maybe even been on a call through the video conferencing service. Quickly, in a very short amount of time, it's become the go-to tool for people suddenly finding themselves, working from home, kind of like we're doing right here for the first time in their careers. That's good for Zoom's business, of course, but there may be some reason to be at least hesitant or concerned about what's going on behind the scenes about our sudden reliance on the platform. And joining us to talk about the data and privacy policies of Zoom is Mehreen Kasan from Input. Welcome to the show, Mehreen.
Thank you for having me.
It is great to have you on today. Thank you so much for taking the time. So first of all, I know I had used Zoom a handful of times prior to now. Now I feel like it's it's almost becoming a verb at this point, kind of like Google, just Zoom me. I'm hearing everybody talking about Zoom. Were there broad concerns about what was going on behind the scenes as far as the policies driving Zoom prior to the coronavirus response, or has this really heightened awareness around, okay, wait a minute, there's something to look at here?
Well, I think in 2019, as I mentioned in our report at Input, the Electronic Privacy Information Center filed an official complaint with the Federal Trade Commission alleging that Zoom bypassed browser security protocol by accessing webcam content. So the complaints were there. Anecdotally, I used it when I was working at a startup in the Lower East Side in New York. And if you went on Reddit, you could see complaints here and there about Zoom's privacy policies. But I think what happened was after the pandemic broke, Zoom's user base, the daily user base, we've also reported this at Input, shot up by 67%. So I think people went from that general understanding we have that says, if it's free, you're the product, you're the currency, from that to seeing the cracks in the system. And it's just followed this very straightforward formula of more attention, more users, more attention to the cracks in the system. In this case, Zoom's privacy policy became a lot more apparent just because of sheer use. People at the Washington Post brought it up, we brought it up, and I think it's like, before this it didn't really see the day of light because it was lesser known, it was not exactly that famous, but now that with people using it so much, people are looking at the problems and they're thinking, okay, there's something wrong here and we should talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So are there are particular features? I know one of them is this attention feature that knows when you've switched away from the video for a certain amount of time, and it reports this back to the administrator of the video. Are these the features that people are concerned with, or is there something kind of deeper from a data collection standpoint happening?
There are several things that come to mind that I think are worth keeping an eye on. There's one that I mentioned in our report, the attention tracking tool, which alerts your administrator, otherwise the host, that you did not have Zoom's window in for about 30 seconds. And that, again, depends on the level of service, the tier of service you have. If you have a corporate account, your host will know if you're not looking at the screen. That's such a very arbitrary ground to work on because, there are 100 of reasons why you're not looking at your screen. It doesn't have to be just you slacking off. The other thing that does come up is, as Sean O'Brien from Yale Privacy Labs mentioned, the ability of administrators to dial into a call whenever they want of that organization. They have the autonomy to do that. They can just interrupt in a meeting and get into that without the say of the others. And then the third feature that I think is worth looking at, apart from the others, is the fact that, again, depending on the level of service you have, you can record a meeting and transcribe the content of that meeting and then distribute the content of that meeting to other people beyond the meeting without the explicit knowledge, permission, or consent of the attendees. So these three things come up, but it's also Zoom's data collection model is not exactly made transparent and apparent to the people that use it. And so those three tools, along with its extraction model, I think they're worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah, and I find myself a little torn because I'm on one hand, when you work for an organization and let's say all of your email, as one example, is filtering through an organization, I've always just kind of assumed, okay, look, my email's passing through the company.
Yeah.
There is little for me to like grab onto that says that I have like 100% privacy through this. I am, after all, using their systems, so I just kind of assume that they have access to this. But it's an assumption that I make, and certainly that's true depending on where you work. In the case of Zoom, is any of this being communicated outside of the EULA, and maybe it's not even explicitly listed in the EULA in the terms of service, but like, is there any way really for employees to know that a manager could just suddenly drop in on their private conversation at any time without the company making that explicitly known to the employees? Zoom isn't doing it, right?
No, so the problem, I mean, this is a really good point that you mentioned. The problem with Zoom is much of its structure centers on giving explicit knowledge to the hosts, and the attendees don't really get to know. They learn later on. So no, your attendees will not know until much later on, after everything has happened. That's how it goes there.
Okay, well then that's why reporting like what you're doing at Input is very important, at least for people to kind of get a better sense of this tool that they might be leaning on. Another kind of a group of people who are leaning on this very heavily are students.
Yes.
I know, I've heard of a number of schools in the area that have shut down, that have moved their curriculum to being taught through Zoom. And so then I take, students younger than 18 using these services, definitely not reading any sort of terms of service or really knowing what's going on behind the scenes. If us adults don't know this, they probably don't know it either. Like, how do those worlds collide? Because there are protections for kids when it comes to technologies online.
So I think before I answer that question, that's a really good question. I think it's worth mentioning here. Nearly everything we use right now in this day and age, whatever app we're using, a platform, network, we all have our own personal threat models, right? So you and I, when we use Twitter, we understand that Twitter has some questionable privacy and ad policies, but we use it nonetheless because we have weighed out the pros and cons according to our personal threat models. And so the idea, the purpose of even talking about Zoom here, of even writing about it in Input that we have repeatedly, is not to say that it's inherently evil or incapable of doing good. It's to say that when you bring students in, and like you mentioned, these kids don't really read the terms of service. I mean, I have to be very frank, I really don't either. When you bring kids into this, we're talking about several things here. Zoom's business philosophy seems to be modeled around this this idea of testing the limits of what you and I find socially acceptable, right? So under pandemics and under unprecedented conditions like this one, rules can be bent, rules can be broken. And so right now, this is a make or break moment for all of us where we can put pressure on Zoom and say, when it comes to students, you need to be explicitly clear about what's being extracted, what's being accessed. In this case, we are not sure if teachers are being safe about sharing data on Zoom. For instance, and this is really alarming, students' progress reports, their behavioral disciplinary information, their mental health information, medical information can be shared on these places. And if they fall into the hands of third-party affiliates, we don't know how they can manipulate that and if that indeed could jeopardize a child's future. So the reason why we're kind of amplifying privacy concerns is because students at this moment are in a very vulnerable, very unparalleled, unprecedented situation, especially concerning preschoolers and kindergartners. They're using this too. I have a niece who's using Zoom right now. So just to go to the question that you said there, when it comes to students and Zoom, I think there's two things that needs to happen. One, students need to know that they have two legislative federal laws in place for them to protect them. And that is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. And then the other one is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, COPPA. And COPPA is for children below the age of 13, whereas FERPA is for protecting the educational progress reports and data of students above that age. So I think it's very important for Zoom to give us an explicit statement, a legally binding statement saying that we follow these rules and the students' data is completely protected, because if we don't, we're kind of in a blind world right now. Does that make sense? So the idea has to, so what I want to say, yes, we do have legal protections. However, they need to be much more contemporary. They need to evolve according to the times we are in right now. To my knowledge, in the years that I've lived on Earth, we haven't been here before where we've had a predominantly virtual, remote classroom world right now because of what we're going through. So I think the laws need to reflect that particular condition. And to that end, I think we need to go beyond FERPA and COPPA, and we need to have security and transparency reports from Zoom that reveal, authentic real-time proof of sound, foolproof infrastructure and security architecture, and also legally binding statements that if I don't abide by XYZ, there will be legal consequences. So that's why I think the concern right now about Zoom is pretty justified, especially when you consider that there are children using this.
All right, and finally, Mehreen, are there steps that people can take? Like if you absolutely have to use Zoom, say, for the school or your company is using it, are there steps that people can take to better protect themselves from some of the stuff that's happening behind the scenes, protect their data, protect their privacy? What do you have to say about that?
So there are steps that you can take. The problem with Zoom and practically any other, Microsoft does this too, and we have issues with Google Hangouts. So all these technologies do have certain steps that you can take and protect yourself. For instance, and I really recommend this for everyone, whether they're a student or a colleague, whoever it is, to enable end-to-end encryption for your direct messages, because Zoom does, according to its privacy policies, it does extract what it calls customer content, and it does have access to your instant messages, and it does get into that. So the extraction model is pretty deep. For that, I think you should really, really enable your end-to-end encryption. You should also make sure that you have your consent enabled, which is, ironically enough, disabled by default. And that allows your administrator to record a meeting because you have it disabled by default. So you just need to go back in there and enable consent, and then they'll need your permission to record a meeting. And another thing I think is really important is to, if you can, and if your teacher, your boss doesn't want you to be on camera and on mic at all times, disable your mic and your cam if you're not saying anything. Definitely do that. And if you can't do that, if they want to see you, then try to reveal personal information as much as you can. They have an option for a green room, so to speak. Kids have been putting things in the background, and it's good to reveal that. Right now you have everything in the open, but if I were to be on Zoom, I would hide that. So there are steps in place, but it's also, I think, this is, like I said, an outbreak. I don't want to say this is a great time to be thinking about these things, but this is an opportunity of a make or break situation where we can apply a pressure and think in more proactive terms. Right now, what we do as a community, as a society, is that we kind of follow this apology-based data model where we find out that these companies have been mining data, they apologize, but the damage has been done. So I think we need to go past that and become more proactive and kind of see those legally binding statements from these companies and say, there should be legal consequences for violating rules. But yeah, you have steps in place right now. You have end-to-end encryption, you have enabling the consent button, and you also have, revealing personal information that can mitigate manipulation chances and abuse chances.